Welcome to Two Open Doors, the podcast that explores our power to open or close the doors of relationship with the important people in our lives. We hope you'll learn from and share your wisdom with our community. Thanks for joining us. Well, good morning, Ezra. Great to see you. Good that you're looking well.
Yeah. Hi, Claude. How are you?
Good. So for the sake of my audience, I just wanted to let them know that this is a special treat for us. As you know, our podcast, Two Open Doors, ranges over the entire terrain, touching on aspects of relationship. And in the past, we've dealt with a few topics that also touch on sexuality and sensuality. As you know, I'm a PhD sexologist, and today we're going to be going in a somewhat similar direction. We're going to talk about a topic that has definitely sexual aspects to it. And in some respects, it goes deeper, though, on the psychological front. And so we have Ezra Pryor. He's a life and intimacy coach, and his focus is really building acceptance around sexuality and gender. So we share that mission. Ezra identifies as non-binary, polyamory, omnisexual, and kinky, and they've lived in a polyamorous lifestyle for over 10 years, so a good base of experience. They're also the director of education at Sanctuary LAX Studios and co-founded the Triskelion Scholarship for BDSM education. Ezra is also he's an author. He has an ebook, Mind Fucking Mindfully, and like myself, hosts a regular podcast called Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast. And they're doing some really interesting work right now on clinical research on something called radical sexual acceptance. And perhaps toward the end, Ezra can explain that to us. But in brief, it's a novel coaching approach that is focused on empowering people in their personal growth, sexual discovery, self-acceptance, and living life to the fullest. So, and you'll be able to contact Ezra after this through their website at AskEzra.com. ASKEZRA.info. So without further ado, I think I'd like to get into our topic today, which is about BDSM, something that a lot of people have curiosity about, and there's not a lot of good information out there. So Ezra, why don't you take it away by start us off with talking about what BDSM is?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think there is really good information out there, but there's also a lot of crap information, and if you don't know, it's hard to tell what's what. So, yeah. So BDSM is a 6-letter acronym, even though it has 4 letters in it. So the BD stands for bondage and discipline. The DS stands for dominance and submission. And the SM stands for sadism and masochism. So it really is like an umbrella term for all kinds of, let's call them sexual minorities, right? Sort of things that are deemed deviant. And it really is a product of the internet where the, rubber fetishism, for example, or leather fetishism might have been its own separate community. But then then when the internet came along, they sort of converged and became one. And I think it's really for the better because, it shows that quote unquote sexual deviance is actually not that uncommon. I mean, yes, each individual community might be pretty scarce, but when you think about all of the different ways that people like to be sexual that deviate from the norm, from what is prescribed, then it actually is maybe even the majority.
Yeah, if I could intrude for just a second, it's very charged to say that something is deviant. And I certainly have heard that term applied to BDSM as well, but we're going to spend some time later in the podcast talking about what that means. As you'll know, as my fellow attendee at Sex Coach U, the main question that you get asked as a sex coach is, am I normal? So this whole notion of deviance, anything that deviates from the norm, and in some cases that deviation is perceived, it's not even real. So we need to talk about that further into the podcast. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah, and I want to clarify too that I don't think of people who have fetishes as deviant, but we may be often labeled that way.
yeah, and in the official and medical literature in the past, it has been labeled that way, and
Mm-hmm.
it's only fairly recently that that's starting to change. But again,
Yeah.
we'll cut back to that in a while. Okay, so talk to us a little more about these three different dimensions of BDSM: BD, DS, and SM.
Yeah, and I think dominance and submission is really going to be the most prevalent. I think that there are power relationships that exist. Sometimes they're fluid, sometimes they're static, sometimes they're a little bit of both. But I think that a power imbalance exists in almost every relationship. I mean, when you think about the infinite possibilities, then the idea that two people in a partnership should be completely balanced in their power at all times is really kind of a preposterous and precarious proposition. It doesn't make sense, right? Even if somebody is like, let's say that you're matched sexually, like the two of you feel the same amount of power sexually. One of you probably makes all the money, right?
Yeah.
Or, let's say you both have good careers, then probably one of you feels really sexy and the other one maybe needs a little bit of help, right? And so these create power imbalances. And the best way that I like to think about dominant submissive relationships is mindful power imbalance. So
Mm.
it's not to say that they're exceptional and that they have a power imbalance, but that we're talking about it and that we're making that choice together.
Actually, that's a very important distinction. Uh, Regardless of what power balance the two people go into the relationship with, there may be an active choice on the part of the partners to reverse that. Uh, Very often, for example, people who are powerful in real life, so to speak, in their jobs, what have you, they want to experience and have the relief of letting go of that power and being dominated. It's a broadening experience for both partners. So this is just another, sex is this infinite playground. It's one particular dimension in which you can experience things that you might not in your normal life.
Yeah. And that does happen. I think it's it's an interesting and fascinating narrative, like this idea that a politician, for example, might want to be submissive in the bedroom, or that somebody who is relatively powerless is going to want to take control in the bedroom. And that does happen, but I think it's an amusing narrative, and it is less frequent than people being consistent across their life. So I think
Yeah.
more often we see that the people who are really assertive in their daily lives are assertive in the bedroom, and the people who are generally submissive in their daily lives are submissive in the bedroom. But again, maybe it's like 70-30, something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, and just as a case in point, I think you have labeled yourself basically as predominantly dominant. No, can you tell
Yeah.
us a little about what that means?
Yeah. So, I think the best way to describe it is that I like to make the choices, and I am attracted to partners who are less interested in making choices.
Mm.
Right. And so what that might look like is that we say, okay, I'm interested in A through Z. What are you
Mhm.
interested in? And, say, okay, well, you're interested in A through P. Great. I'm going to throw out P through Z because that we don't align there. That's fine. We're just going to focus on A through P. And then what from A through P happens is my choice, right?
Mhm.
So, my partners don't, I'll say, hey, do you want to do this? Do you want to do A, B, and F? And they'll go, whatever. I don't want to make a choice.
Yeah.
you know, um, they could even become frustrated when they're asked to make a choice.
Interesting. This is a good point to bring in the reality of negotiation between the partners. So it's not that one is running roughshod over the other. They're actually aligning preferences and,
Mm,
and negotiating what specifically they want to do together.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah,
And
so the
there's
dominant is lead.
the dominant is lead in the experience. The dominant isn't necessarily lead in the negotiation.
Ah,
And
yes.
there was this there was this really popular misconception a couple years ago. I'm not sure how many people still hold it, but there was this phrase, the sub has all the power, right? Which is just categorically untrue. I think that a lot of times in the unspoken power exchange relationship, the person who is submissive has less power in that unspoken relationship than they do in this mindful power exchange. And so they see that submissives in BDSM actually have a lot of power and get to negotiate, and that, hopefully that negotiation is happening on a relatively even power, field. And so they see that person as saying, oh, well, that person has more power than I do. But if the sub had all the power, they would be the dom. And it wouldn't, because you can, I mean, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but you can be dominant and bottom, or you can be submissive and top, which is to say doing the thing to the other person. And from all outward experience, all outward observers, it looks like the other person is the top or the bottom or the dom or the sub than it actually is going on.
Yeah, but the point is, in any negotiation, you're targeting a win-win. Both parties have to be satisfied with the results, and so you talk about how you're going to get there together, in whatever path the two choose. So
absolutely, and I think with mindful power exchange, we're not insecure about that power dynamic because we've had a conversation about it, and if it's not working out, we can sort of come back to the negotiating table. But I think when it's unspoken and it's not mindful, there is the real insecurity. And so people do things to sort of hold each other down or hold each other up, as it were, that are maybe not consensual.
Got it. Yeah. Let's go in a somewhat different direction now, just to make this all more concrete. If we could talk about a few of the practices, fetishes, role play, that sort of thing. Again, it's a wide world out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think role play is a super popular activity. I think that it's probably like 80 or 90% of people engage in role play at some point or another. And they may not identify as kinky, but it's definitely a kinky activity where you could sort of say, okay, I'm the landlord and now you owe me rent, and how are you going to pay for it? Right. It's one of my favorite ones. Or, I'm a burglar and I'm getting into your house. What are you going to do to assuage me? Right.
Yeah.
Those are all kind of fun things.
Which is
Impact play. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's a testament to how important imagination is in sexuality overall.
Yeah. And it gives us an opportunity to embody things that maybe don't line up with our character. Right. Like we can be like, let's say I'm a nice guy and I really pride myself on being a nice guy. Well, if I pretend to be a bank robber and you're the teller, well, the bank robber's not a nice guy. So now I have permission to be, rough and tumble, right?
Yeah, it lets you explore a space that you wouldn't otherwise get to.
Yeah. And I think impact play is super popular. I mean, how many people spank during sex, right? Or spank in a sexual way? I think that's a huge number of people. I mean, we can go back to the Kinsey report where as many as 10% of American adults and say they're kinky, right? But really, what is kinky? And if we look at, these activities that are labeled as deviant, I think the Kinsey report also found 50% of people bite during sex or like being bitten, and that's just one fetish. So I think that kind of indicates that, we're in the majority. If you group us all together, but bondage is really, really popular. And with bondage, it's often rope. It's often, ways of restraining somebody, and it can feel like a hug that just keeps on going, which I think is part of the draw. I think it's also like an excuse for intimacy. Tying somebody up, you can't help but touch them. You're not, there's really no way to tie somebody up without touching them, unless you lasso them, I guess.
Is that also an exertion of dominance over the person? with permission, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the rope represents control, right? And when you tie somebody up, you're saying this is how you cannot move, or this is how you are limited to movement,
Um,
right?
that's also a great testament to the trust that's involved in these relationships. To let someone truss you up and render you immobile, basically helpless, you're showing vulnerability in doing that. I
Hmm.
think that's something that's predominant throughout any good sexual practice, the ability to open up to receive and to trust your partner. I mean, you can't have good sex with someone that you're very afraid of, for example. You have to know that they're going to treat you right.
Yeah. Well, and I think rope is a really good example of why it is important to have community. So, there are nerves all over the body, and you can do nerve damage with rope. If you're tying in the wrong place or if you're tying in the wrong way, then you can do permanent damage to somebody's nerves. And that's pretty scary. And so community creates a safety net of sorts where you get to go to classes and learn from other people about, what are the things that you should avoid, and what are the things that you can do a lot of. And if I was going to give like intro uh, rope advice, if this is your first time or maybe your fifth or sixth time where you want to tie up your partner, I would say first use scarves or neckties because they present a broad profile, and a broad profile is going to distribute the force, and you're going to be much less likely to do damage than if you have rope, which can have a lot of force in a single spot.
Yeah, that's very practical. This is a good opportunity to talk a little about communication too in the course of something like tying a person up. If there is something that was unintentionally very painful, something indication that something is awry. On the one hand, if the person has basically ceded their power to you, how do you know when to stop?
Yeah, and
Basically,
that's really valuable thing to talk about. And I think that we always have to remember that consent is reversible. So no matter what you've agreed to, if you're not able to say, you know what, I changed my mind, then you're in an unsafe situation, right? Um, I think it's the top or the dominant's responsibility to read the situation. And then if they think that either they're out of their skill set or that the bottom or submissive is doing something that's now unsafe, or that you're doing something together that feels like it may be unsafe, then it's their responsibility to stop the scene as well. Um, there is a practice of using like a code word because sometimes people want to say no during a scene. Sometimes people want to say, no, don't stop. And what they really mean is, don't stop. Right. And so in that case, we use safe words. Right. And so a safe word, most common safe word is like red. Right. So red means I'm done. Right. Um, and I also use yellow, and yellow means like, hey, like come check in with me or switch sides or use a different toy, depending on the context. But yellow sort of means like, hey, pay attention to this, right? Um, a lot of people like to use fruits. I don't know why, but everybody wants to say pineapple, grapefruit, mango.
yeah.
And yeah, and the safe word means full stop. The red at least means full stop, unless you've negotiated a safe word that means something else by default.
Yeah. So the point is there is a safety net. And again, that's prearranged. You mentioned a very important word that we don't have a lot of time for today, but the notion of consent. That's at
Mm,
the basis of not only BDSM, but of course, any intimate practice, sexual practices. And that's a long, long topic and discussion in its own right. But when people go into experimenting with something new, they they have to do so willingly, genuinely willingly. And so there is the notion of a yes versus hell yes. They're different things. One, especially for example, many women, we're acculturated to be compliant and not say no. And in the case of something as intimate as a sexual practice, you have to be straightforward and you have to mean what you're saying, or people can't trust you. And then they don't know where the boundaries are. So
Yeah, and that I think is the biggest barrier to fun and safer play, right?
yeah.
Is the ability to speak up and state your boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I get a lot of people come to me for a BDSM coaching service, and almost invariably, the two things that we can work on are self-knowledge and communication.
Yeah.
Those two things, it's going to help you be a better dominant. It's going to help you be a better submissive. It's going to help you be a better slave or master or pet or owner or top or bottom or, daddy or little girl, whatever, because when you know what your needs are and your wants and your limits and your soft limits and your hard limits, you're going to be able to better figure out what's a match and what's not a match and play in a space of overlap. And it can feel like a service to conceal unpleasant emotions, but it really is a disservice because concealing them doesn't make them not exist, right? It may mean the other person doesn't experience them, but you're still not having a great time, and that person is probably going to notice. And you could have had a better time if you talked about it.
Right. Again, in more vanilla sex circumstances, the people who fake orgasm, for example, are doing a disservice to their relationship. So that kind of both self-knowledge and honesty is essential in any kind of an intimate practice. So if you have a few other highlights for practices that are commonplace, let's put those on the table, and then let's move on to terminology.
Yeah, I mean, pain play is really popular. And I mean, we talked a little bit about impact, but the idea that a sadist who is somebody who enjoys somebody else's pain, or a masochist who enjoys pain, is sick. I mean, we mentioned it a little bit recently, but the psychology community considered it to be an illness until 2013, right? So really just 10 years ago at this point, even if it was consensual, even if it was not negatively impacting somebody's life, it was considered an illness. And so that is a burden we are still crawling out from under. And unfortunately, what can exist is an internalized shame. We talk about like homophobia or transphobia. I think there's also something like kink phobia, where we can hate or be afraid of those things that are part of ourselves and take that shame and then push it onto others and project. And it's a real problem in terms of the arc of discovery. There's nothing wrong with you if you like to get spanked. There's nothing wrong with you if you fantasize about, getting slapped in the face or slapping somebody in the face, and if we can accept those things, then we can be much better at managing the risk involved. Like think about, alcohol prohibition, right? People weren't automatically more responsible with alcohol when we as a nation prohibited it. Instead, people were getting poisoned because there was bootleg alcohol, and people were binge drinking because they wanted to finish it before the cops showed up, right? And so, when we remove something from taboo, we give ourselves an opportunity to really be honest with ourselves and have a healthy relationship to the risk involved in that activity.
Yeah, it really amounts to owning our shadow, and we all have shadow and light. And so it's a very liberating thing to look in the face who we truly are. So a few of the other practices you mentioned, pain. So things like wax play or
Yep.
torture, Wartenberg wheel, that sort of thing, uh, are examples of that. There's also electrostimulation that I'm aware of.
hmm
You mentioned, not in the pain context, but rope play is also from shibari, I guess from the Japanese term, right?
Yeah, I think shibari is really like an
Ah,
artistry sort of way of going about it, where you're really looking at making decorative rope things. But there's certainly more to bondage than just that. There's more to bondage than shibari, and there's more to bondage than rope as
yeah,
well. But yeah, I mean these are all good options. And really, when we look at BDSM and what is done in BDSM is not just about pain, it's also about exploring other sensations,
yes.
right? And so like electrostim, for example, can involve the tens unit, which at lower voltages is not painful. It has a sensation. You can make your muscles move without trying to move them, which is kind of fun. Um, but sensation is broader than pleasure and pain, and
Yeah,
BDSM gives us permission to explore, I think.
right. And then just to cap off this segment, the notion of edge play, it's the deep end of the pool, and it involves practices that are less widely practiced and for which maybe some care, a special care is required. So can you just say a little bit about that? Things like blunt
Yeah. Yeah,
piercing.
and again, like this is one of those words that has like a couple different definitions, right? That sort of overlap a little bit. So edge play is any play that involves a particular high level of risk, but also is any play that approaches somebody's personal limits. And so if you are terrified of tickling, then tickling could be edge play, even though it doesn't necessarily involve a special risk. Um, but the higher risk edge plays include knife play, fire play. I would put electrostimulation in there as well, breath play, right? Um, and suspension is definitely there where you're, with rope or other bondage, you are lifted off the ground. Um, and also, I would put mind fucking in there as well because that's one of those activities where you don't necessarily know if you've done damage until after it's done, even sometimes a year later.
Say a little bit about what that involves.
So mind fucking is really common. I think everybody sort of naturally does it as, we are intelligent beings. And so we mess with each other a little bit here and there, like you're going to get it when you get home, or I've got a surprise for you and I'm not telling you what it is, right? Those are like mind fucks. Um, and is really anytime we use the mind, we sort of hack the way that the mind works to create anticipation or sensation or illusion. Um, and that's the book I wrote, Mind Fucking Mindfully.
Excellent. Okay, let's talk a little bit about terminology because there's a whole bunch of it. Uh, if you could lead us through a few of the predominant terms, certainly starting with kink.
Yeah, so kink is a description of some of these non-traditional sexual activities. Um, and it's not in super common use in terms of its separation from fetish, but if we want to use those terms precisely, we can say that kink is something that is interesting sexually but isn't required, and fetish is something that is absolutely required for a pleasurable experience.
Ah, okay. And a few of the other, you mentioned already power exchange. I think that we've addressed sufficiently. The notion of top and bottom, for example, or switch.
Yeah, yeah. So top and bottom is a relationship where one person is the doer and the other person is the doee. I mean, if we look at, heteronormative sex, the man is usually sort of positioned as the top in during penetration, right? But if the woman wants to be on top of the man, then now they're the top, right?
Yeah.
And switch is somebody who is willing to both top and bottom, that may be in the scene or, in separate scenes. We've got a few more on the list here. Sub, dom, dominatrix. I would say let's break this up actually into two categories, S types and D types. So submissive types could include submissive, slave, bottom, pet, little, middle, yeah, property. And D types or dominant types could be dom, dominatrix, dom with two M's and an E, could be owner, could be handler, could be daddy or mommy, could be master, could be owner, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
What about in terms of a play session, some of the terms that apply there, the notion of play or scene?
So with play is usually used to describe the activity that is in the BDSM activity. It could also be used to describe sexual activity. A scene is the duration in which we are doing that BDSM activity, right? It may be if we're role playing, then we're like in character for the whole scene. They tend to last no more than 45 minutes to an hour, but they can go much longer. And a session may describe a scene. I've also heard it using the word session to describe like pro BDSM scenes and things like that.
Huh. Got it. And in a different direction, what about the notion of an exhibitionist or voyeur?
Sure. So an exhibitionist is somebody who enjoys being observed, right? Somebody who likes being watched, and a voyeur is somebody who likes watching. So they're counterparts to each other.
Yeah. Any other broadly used terms that you want to share with people?
Yeah, I mean, dungeon's a great one. A dungeon describes a BDSM community space. A professional dungeon is one where there are professional subs or switches or DOMs that you can hire. And most dungeons do have community parties, but certainly not all of them. One more I'd like to throw out there is munch. So a munch describes a get together that's typically at a restaurant or a bar where people who are kinky can get to know each other in a sort of low pressure environment.
Got it. Thanks. It's a pretty good dictionary to work with. Let's talk a little bit about something that interests me in particular, which is the motivation, psychological motivation behind this universe of kink.
Yeah. So motivation. Why do we do it? I think the primary motivation is human connection. I think that we are social animals, and the prospect of doing things on our own is often less appealing. So I think that BDSM is a pathway to intimacy that is more accessible to a lot of people than sex. Right? So I think that's the primary motivation is human connection. The second motivation I would say is the body as a vessel for pleasure. Right? And so we do things that are pleasurable. And you might say, well, that's good enough for the bottom, but what about the top? And I think that for the top, it is about, that sympathetic nervous system where we feel what other people are feeling, right? If I can make you laugh, then it makes me happy. So if I can make you orgasm, then that's going to make me feel really aroused, right? And I think that there is also an aspect of what Freud called the compulsion to repeat, where when we have these traumatic experiences, we are desperate to make sense of them. And one way to make sense of them is to recreate them.
Mhm.
And I think we have two options. We can do so mindlessly. We could do so by accident and sort of, fall into relationships that remind us of our unfortunate experiences before. Or we can sort of set up a role play or set up a scene where we have a chance to explore some of those shadow experiences in a relatively safe environment, right? In a risk-aware environment. And then we can reprocess those things and get some leverage over them. I heard somebody say after a particularly heavy scene, they go, well, now I know that if I was ever, captured by the enemy and tortured, that I would be able to withstand it. Right. And so not only was it pleasurable at the time, but they are given a new fortitude, a new resilience that did not exist before.
Yeah. It's all part of the benefit of doing self-exploration in areas you might not otherwise visit.
Yeah.
Good.
And I meet a lot of people who are averse to sexuality, averse to penetrative sex, I should say. Right. And so if that's not an option for you for whatever reason, then, what other avenues do you have for intimacy? And BDSM creates a myriad of opportunities for non-penetrative intimacy.
Yeah. Yet another indication of how narrowly some people construe sex and yet how wide the terrain actually is, the many options that are available to you. So
Mm.
just interestingly, really little of what you've just described as motivation has to do necessarily with sexuality. It's a lot broader than that. It's the domain of the mind. Uh,
Well, I mean, I might be the odd one out here, but I consider sexuality a wellspring of power. And so if there is something that bothers me, if I can sexualize it, it bothers me less, right?
mm,
Because if I feel disempowered in something, then, I can use sexuality to feel more powerful, right? Like, I have a credit union. And so I go to a different credit union because it's more convenient. And they have a relationship where I can bank through a different credit union, right? And they
oh,
always
interesting.
ask me for my business. And I like to pretend that they want me sexually, right? So I've taken this situation where the bank has made it very, very limited in terms of the power that I have, right? And now I've interjected this like fake sexual narrative of desire and denial. And it
Mm,
makes me feel a lot more in control. It makes me feel a lot more powerful because I've sexualized that. And I do so with great caution to not um, sexualize the teller directly or make the teller feel uncomfortable because that would be really unethical.
yeah, that makes sense. Great. All right. Since we've been introducing some terminology and we understand some of the psychology now, let's talk a little bit about the expectations, the conduct of the practice of BDSM and some of the
Mm,
practices that go with that. So like we talked a little bit about consent and the
yeah.
different flavors of consent. It can be very passive or it can be truly active and full of self-knowledge.
Yeah, well, I think that passive consent is the norm in the greater culture, right? Not in BDSM, but in, American culture, for example. Like you can sleep with somebody without ever saying, "Hey, do you want to sleep with me?" Not to say that it's not consensual, but that consent is everything that isn't a no, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it is easy to demonize that and sort of say, oh, that's wrong or that's bad. It's not wrong or bad. It's just different. And certainly it's susceptible to abuse or misuse. But there's a place for it, right? I like to think about the certain sex parties will have like a dark room where you go into the dark room and you can just kind of grope around and touch and do whatever to other people. And by being in the room, you've consented, right? And as long as everybody in that room understands that's what it is, then that's perfectly fine. And it's a wonderful opportunity. But in BDSM, we tend to be a little bit more careful because we're doing things that are potentially really risky. So we have an active consent culture. Now, active consent is it's a no unless you get a yes, right? And so it really means we're going to get consent for every specific activity that that we do. And I think a great model for active consent is the FRIES acronym for consent. And we don't, we have limited time, so I would say go look up the FRIES acronym for consent. But in short, it is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific.
Very good.
Yeah.
All right, we talked a little bit about the notion of negotiation and basically a contract for a particular scene or a session. So
yeah. I like to discourage people from using the term contract just because it implies that there's some legal significance. There really isn't. You think of California as a particularly liberal state, but it's still not legal to consent to being spanked, if you can believe it, right? And so you can't have a contract that says, okay, I'm going to spank you this many times for this much, this many times a day. Like it wouldn't hold up in court because that's an illegal activity. But agreements, or if you want to call them contracts, call them contracts. But BDSM agreements are very useful in that they take the negotiation that we've done verbally and we put it in writing so that there's it's not ambiguous.
Right.
And it is perfectly acceptable for the bottom to lead the negotiation. I think the tendency is for the top or the dominant, the D type, whatever, to lead the negotiation because they tend to be more active than their counterparts. But there's nothing wrong with a submissive leading the negotiation, especially if you feel limited in your sense of safety. That can help you feel safe by being in control of that negotiation.
Yep. Again, makes sense. And then if you could just tell us a little about SSC, rack, and prick.
Yeah. So these are models for consent within BDSM, and SSC stands for safe, sane, and consensual. RAC stands for risk-aware consensual kink, and prick stands for personal responsibility in consensual kink. And I tend to side with RAC the most. SSC is a little bit reactionary to the concept that sadomasochism is an illness, right? So we start off saying like we're sane. This is not an illness. But the word sane is problematic because, who's to say what state of mental health qualifies as sane? Like, you may be a doctor, Claude, but I am no doctor. I am not qualified to say what is or is not sane, right? And then also safe is problematic, right? Because we're doing things that are risky. We're doing things that involve a risk. It's not safe to jump in a car. It's not safe to eat a sandwich with a toothpick in it. People die from toothpicks every year, right? So I, some people still do use, SSC, but I tend to avoid it. I like risk-aware consensual kink because it has a focus on understanding what is the risk and that what we do is consensual, right? I also like prick, personal responsibility in consensual kink, but I have seen a lot of people use prick to sort of avoid responsibility and to say, look, it was the sub's responsibility to be aware of the risk as well, right? And I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that submissives or bottoms or S-types, whatever, should be well aware of the risk. It shouldn't just be a matter of trust. There should be a verification, right? And if prick could help submissives understand that they are in fact responsible for their own bodies and are responsible for understanding what is the risk involved, then I think it's good. If on the other hand, it gives D-types permission to not be so active in creating informed consent, then it's not so good. So I sort of tend to side with rack because I feel like the jury is still out on prick.
Yeah, I can see how the prick notion or approach could lead to mutual finger pointing, basically,
Yeah.
in an attempt to duck full responsibility. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I tend to think of things in the rightest possible situation. And I think what it should mean is everyone is responsible together. But
correct.
I don't know if it's misused, it's misused.
Got it. Right. Let's get on the downslope here for our session, and we'll talk a little bit about stigma. We mentioned it in passing earlier. There's a lot of historical depth to the characterization that's been applied to some of the practices we've been discussing. Historically, back from certainly the 1800s, with works like Psychopathia Sexualis, notions of perversion, deviation, aberration. These are all really pejorative terms that have been applied to some of these practices, and yet they not only have persisted in society, but they're more widespread than I think most people realize. So it's important to be aware of the potential for mischaracterizing these practices in a negative way. And thankfully, the medical community, for example, has headed in a more positive direction, but only in recent times.
Yeah, very recently. It's just honestly in a flash of a pan. And
Yeah.
I think, you pointed to early 20th century, late 19th century, right?
Mm.
There has been a lot of time before that. Before modern medicine, there was a tremendous amount of time. And I think that varied sexual practices have always been part of humanity, right? I mean, you can go back to, the ancient Sumerians where, goddess Inanna, their celebration was a day of female domination, right? I can't remember which prominent Greek philosopher it was, but there was one of them was a real fan of crawling around on hand and knee at the beck and call of dominant women. So it existed forever, right? And then there was this notion of proper sexuality that sort of came into play I mean, you could even look at, the existence of homosexuality and homophobia. There wasn't a label of homosexuality. It was just part of being human, right? And so I think that in order to separate people who are, non-traditionally sexual from people who are traditionally sexual, then you have to create this notion of, proper sexuality. And I think that came into play with the Puritans and some other religions, enforced monogamy, things like that. And then the medical community got a hold of it and really let ideology drive observation, right?
Right.
I mean, who's to say that being aroused by feet is a problem, right? I mean, they put people in jail.
Yeah. No, you're right. And actually pointing to ancient history as evidence for the nature of sexuality, you're absolutely right. The ancient Greeks, for example, had very different attitudes about homosexuality than we do. It was much more normalized. And just the whole question of what is deemed normal is very much potentially a political football. And unfortunately,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that results in a lot of pain and lack of enlightenment, that as long as people are prevented from being able to explore and own fully who they are, harm will follow. And that has been the historical trend.
Yeah. Shame does not help any individual. It might help society, but it never helped an individual, and I think, all the philias, all of these ways of describing sexual attractions are pathological, and it's really challenging because sometimes we don't know how to describe them besides with these antiquated
Right.
disease terms, right? Um,
It's the
so
only terminology that exists, unfortunately.
yeah, yeah. Well, and then the Marquis de Sade, right, who is the namesake of sadism, he spent most of his time in prison,
Yeah.
right? Granted, he did like feed people to lions and stuff. So I would say maybe he took it a little far, right? But there was this notion that it was a common practice among nobles, among like these elites who could afford um, to deviate from social norms were doing a lot of it, and that he was kind of the scapegoat, right?
Right.
That he was sort of blamed for a lot of other things, and a lot of other people were really into it too. But instead of um, coming to terms with it, they found somebody to blame.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's flip that coin and talk about some of the potential benefits of some of these practices.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. One of my favorite benefits is that it's sexy as fuck.
yeah.
Um, but you can get high from pain, from like they call it runner's high sometimes, right? Where
Endorphin.
like a certain amount of exertion can lead to endorphins.
Right.
Um, and it's a pathway for intimacy. I think anything that staves off the unfortunate human condition of loneliness is good. Um, it is a pathway to pleasure for a lot of people. Um, it is a method of acquiring intimacy for some folks that will simply never be able to access those traditional roots of intimacy.
Mhm.
It is a wellspring of power for many people. I found my power in BDSM, and then I was able to, you know, transfer it to other parts of my life. Um, it is a way to process things, I mean, if you've got consent from your partner, then you can work on some shadow stuff, and you can process some past trauma. I would strongly recommend having that conversation ahead of time and not doing it uh in secret, right? But like, for example, if you've had medical trauma, then maybe you could do medical play, and you could sort of add a nice note to an otherwise terrible deck of cards.
Ah, yeah, and the benefits to self-knowledge in general of exploring these areas of yourself freely and without shame and stigma. I mean, that's a very liberating thing, I think. Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of terrain over the last almost an hour or so. Why don't we wrap up with a few resources you might recommend for those who want to dig deeper? And then certainly also please talk about what you offer. Clearly you have a lot of depth that you can offer people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for people who want better definitions or more definitions than I've been able to provide today, I would recommend BDSM Wiki. It's better than Wikipedia. Some of these terms just aren't on Wikipedia or in the dictionary. Um, and also for finding local parties or clubs or munches, I would recommend FetLife. And FetLife can garner some unwanted attention, especially for female-bodied individuals. So you may want to have an anonymous profile if you are particularly concerned with getting unwanted attention. If you want attention, it's a great way to get it. Um, and Yeah, so those are the two things I would recommend for people who are interested in exploring. And I'd also recommend as a first step to go to a class or to go to a munch, because those are really low pressure environments. Nobody's going to ask you to play in those spaces.
Mhm.
And even if you go to a party and somebody asks you to play, it should be less pressure than like at a bar, for example, because we are so concerned with consent. But I can't say that it's always going to be that way.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
in,
like FetLife is a good vehicle for finding local groups, for example.
yeah, local groups, local events. Um, I would say the best strategy is go to a munch and ask people what's happening in the area, and they'll tell you, they'll give you a sense of what's going on. Because sometimes you can see an event on FetLife and you go, oh, I don't know anything about this besides what they've written. And you can get a sense of, what that event is like from people who go, right?
Yep. Very good.
Yeah. And in terms of my own resources, you've already mentioned my website, askezra.info. There's my podcast, Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast. I wrote the book Mind Fucking Mindfully, which is available on Amazon. I also sell a signed copy if you want to, support the author and get your own personalized inscription. That is the way to do it. That's on Gumroad. And lastly, I just started phase 2 of my clinical sexology research project. It is a study on the efficacy of radical sexual acceptance, which is my own innovative coaching method. And it's really great. If you're interested in participating, you could get $1,000 worth of free coaching if you qualify. Even if you don't qualify, you can get an ebook on the subject just for signing up. And also, people who complete the study are entered into a prize drawing of either a $100 Visa gift card, a $50 gift card to stockroom.com, or a free 1-year membership to Sanctuary LAX Studios.
Very good. And you do coaching sessions remotely as well as locally, or? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I do life coaching, BDSM coaching, and intimacy coaching. And of course, I do the radical sexual acceptance method as well.
Very good. Lots of good options. And clearly you have a lot of information to share. So Ezra, I want to just close with a sincere thanks for all the great information you've shared with our audience today. And I wish you the best in your practice and look forward to continuing to get to know you better and continue our friendship.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's nice to know you, Claude.
Likewise. And thanks so much for the gift of your time.